Hello, I'm Nina Melendez, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. Today, we're talking about higher education and whether college as we know it needs a makeover. As companies are shifting towards skill-based hiring and the cost of that diploma becoming more expensive, many people are rethinking the merits of a four-year degree. Is the return on the investment worth it? And if not, what is the alternative? We're going to unpack some of this on the show today, but I want to hear from you. If you have insights or questions, put them in the stream. You're going to want to hear from my next guest. He is Kevin Carey. He is the Vice President of Education Policy and Knowledge Management at New America. He is a contributing writer for the Chronicle of Higher Education and edits the annual Washington Monthly College Guide. He's also the author of the book, The End of College, Creating the Future of Learning and the University of Everywhere. He has his master's from Ohio State University. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Kevin, I just want to start high level. For years we've been told that we need a four-year degree, we need a bachelor's to get a job, to even get the foot in the door. But now more and more Americans have that degree. How has the value of that education changed?
Well, I think it's still pretty valuable. I mean, if you look at what happened a year ago during the recession caused by the pandemic, almost all the people who lost their jobs were people who didn't have bachelor's degrees, people who were in lots of different parts of the economy, whereas the white collar part of the economy did pretty well because those were jobs that people were able to transition and continue to do while they worked at home. And in different ways, that's been the pattern in most of the last economic downturns. There's more security in a college-educated job than in other parts of the economy. I think the bigger question is, how much are people paying for college degrees? What kind of college degree are they getting? And depending on the price and the subject and the institution, the return on investment can vary a lot.
So money aside, which I really want to talk about the student debt problem, and the type of degree aside, do you think that American college prepares students for the workforce?
It depends on what you study, right? I mean, you can go to college, and if you want to be a school teacher, you have to go to college, and you can get a degree in education and do that. If you want to be an accountant, and you can go and study accounting. If you want to be a nurse, there are a lot of professions that require you to go to college. And so it's not even really a question of if, it's just a question of how much and where. There are a lot of other kinds of college degree that don't really prepare you specifically for a job. And I think that's where there's more uncertainty and more anxiety. It's probably one of the things that's pushing more people into graduate school, right? You get a bachelor's degree in something kind of generalized, and then you specialize in going to graduate school and getting something that actually is more tied to a profession. But of course, that means more time and more debt.
I actually want to bring up a quote that you wrote in the Chronicle for Higher Education. You wrote, "The whole apparatus of university-based arts education is a financial catastrophe for students. Taking on loads of debt to train for a profession that is commonly modified by the word starving is a terrible idea. And it doesn't really matter what kind of college is involved. For-profit, non-profit, public, the numbers are awful." I loved this quote. I loved this, the entire article that you wrote. Some people though might say that that college is more, it's not so much what you're learning, right? It's the name that is stamped on the degree. It's the network of people that you're able to have. What is your response to that?
There are very few colleges that really give you a return on the name and the network. It's not that they don't exist, but only a tiny percentage of the people who go to college go to one of those places. And even those places are no guarantee. You still have to go out in the world and prove yourself and do something useful for someone if you want to get a job. When I talked about sort of arts education and that, the quote you mentioned, that was kind of really illustrating my point. One of the big problems with the way our college education system works is you can go to school for a very stable, well-paying profession, of which there are many, or you can go to school for a famously unstable, not well-paying profession, like being a painter or a theater actor, which are wonderful things to spend your time. But I think we all understand not exactly the ticket to necessarily a guaranteed income. Colleges charge you the same amount of money. And in fact, often arts education costs more because it's expensive to provide. So it's not that college isn't worth it, but it's definitely not a guarantee.
I want to pause the conversation very quickly and say hi to some of the members joining us from all over the world. It looks like Leonard from Albania, Anissa from Los Angeles, Benjamin from Raleigh, and Gregory from Kentucky. And would love to hear from you. You know, I would say my big question is, do you think college prepares professionals for the workforce? And if you got a degree, do you feel like your degree was worth it? I'm here speaking with Kevin, Carrie. Kevin, you know, the emphasis on degree has arguably reduced the trade workers that we have out there. You know, how do we fix this? What are your thoughts?
There is simultaneously a high demand for certain trade workers, and also often employers will say they have a hard time finding really good qualified people. That's an example where it's not that we don't need college. What we don't necessarily need is the traditional 4-year bachelor's degree. Where I work at an organization called New America, we have a whole program that's focused around apprenticeship, which is actually a pre-college method for training people for careers that goes back for thousands of years. That is mostly just used in a fairly narrow, here in the United States, used in a fairly narrow band of building trades and other kinds of things like that. But if you go to Europe, other places like that, it's used in a larger percentage of professions. We think, so what we do is we work in partnership with community colleges to create pathways to jobs in the trades and elsewhere through an apprenticeship system that actually pays people to work while they're in school, and they get a credential, a college credential at the same time, which they can then use to transfer to get a bachelor's degree if they want to, or they can just stay in the trades.
We do something somewhat similar in the US with work study. What are your thoughts on work study?
There are a small number of colleges that have a tradition of doing a good job with work study, but there aren't that many of them. So it is not very many people really get that good opportunity.
You know, I did work study when I was in undergrad, and I was working at the Alumni Association, and I was an English major, and I don't know what working at the Alumni Association had anything to do with me being an English major. But I did think, like, I feel like work study should actually be more relevant to the degree that I'm earning.
It's kind of just a form of financial aid for a lot of students.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like it's a way to get some money, and you end up sitting at the desk checking people into the gym or something like that.
Yeah.
But colleges can make work study work better if they put their mind to it.
What are your thoughts on short-term training programs? Does that sort of help fill the gap there?
It can. You know, there's a big push in Congress right now, actually, to expand eligibility for the Pell Grant, which is the Pell Grant is the large federal grant for low-income students to go to college. Right now, you have to go to at least a 9-month-long program or more to be eligible for a Pell Grant. There's a pretty strong push to make the Pell Grant eligible for shorter-term programs. They can be good, but I really think for that kind of system to work, there needs to be a strong level of accountability for outcomes in the workforce. So let's only fund short-term programs that have a proven track record of leading to better jobs and better pay for students. Otherwise, you kind of open up the system for, you know, shady organizations to kind of exploit the aid system. And not all short-term programs are good. It takes time sometimes to learn the things that you really need to know.
And it's still relatively new. Does New America have data on sort of the results of short-term these programs and how helpful they are in advancing your career trajectory? It's
all over the map. You know, it just depends on the program. It depends on the state. It depends an awful lot on the field. You know, you can get, you know, like there's a lot of demand for truck drivers, and you can get you can get into a short-term truck driving program. And there's a lot of, you know, you can get a job from that, but that's a field that has like 100% annual turnover in terms of employment, because driving a truck isn't like the greatest way to spend your time. And so it might not be the case that a short-term credential is really a great path for a lot of people.
I want to talk about the money of it all. And when we talk about the return on investment on your degree, I mean, you can't ignore just how costly college has become. I want to bring up a couple of stats, just sort of like the numbers behind the student debt problem. When you look at this, we've got 1.7 trillion in total US student debt, 44.7 million Americans who are holding it, and then interest rates for private loans can run as high as 12.45%. This was in September of 2020, and this is from Student Loan Hero. This is where it's sourced. When you look at these numbers, you know, looking at, I'm like still shocked, and I look at these numbers all the time as a debt holder. Is the four-year degree worth the money that is spent on it, all considered?
Yeah, I mean, it is quite a story, the story of American student debt. And, you know, it's the one kind of debt that seems to be immune to economic conditions. So we saw this, you know, after the 2008 recession, this huge deleveraging where there was less credit card debt, you know, people were overextended, and you kind of track these lines where debt would go up and debt would go down, except for student debt, which just kept going up in almost a straight line. It was, you know, less than $1 trillion 15 years ago. It's up to $1.7 trillion and climbing now. It is important to remember that a lot of that debt is for graduate school, not just for, so we want to make a distinction between borrowing for an undergraduate degree and borrowing for a graduate degree. The overwhelming amount of it is also issued by the federal government, by the U.S. Department of Education. And many of those interest rates aren't so high. You know, they're actually pretty low right now because we're in a low interest rate environment, and federal loans are pegged to the market. So, you know, a subsidized undergraduate Stafford loan is only about 3.5% right now. And the other big factor is that you can only borrow up to about $30-some thousand from the federal government at those rates to get an undergraduate degree. But you can borrow essentially the entire cost of a master's program, a PhD, or a professional degree, like a law degree or a medical degree, from the government. So even though graduate students are only a minority of all students, or a lot more undergraduates than graduate students, about half of all federal student loan dollars are now being put out for graduate school. So they're a big part of that 1.7 trillion, a disproportionate amount, because grad school is a lot more expensive than undergrad, even though it doesn't last as long.
I mean, bringing back to my earlier question, you know, if there are so many Americans who have a bachelor's degree, then a master's degree is, you know, supposed to sort of put you a little bit more in a more attractive candidate for jobs. But then if you're walking away and you've got all of this debt, and let's say the debt isn't commensurate with what you're going to earn when you graduate, how do you reconcile this? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, we're up to about 35% of adults have a bachelor's degree now, which is an increase. It was about 30% maybe 10, 15 years ago. Another 8 or 9% have a 2-year credential, associate's degree, or something like that. You know, again, so there are two things kind of happening at once. You know, the economy has changed over time. You know, the availability of good middle class or better jobs that you can get without a college degree has declined. So you really do need some credential or strong proof of your skills, and maybe you get it from a degree, maybe you get it from some non-traditional source like your LinkedIn profile. And so that's real, and the market has responded. More people have gone to get credentials because of that. There's also this thing called credentialism happening, where people just kind of want the degree for its own sake. A lot of employers just used a degree as a shorthand for hiring because it's a cheap way to do it, right? You just filter out everyone who doesn't have a degree because it's hard to find people. Again, that's what LinkedIn is to, in some ways, to try to solve that problem and bring more information into the system that didn't used to be there. So your company is in some ways a solution to that problem, or you know, or can be. But what happens when you have that credentialism is people have to take that next step and go get the master's degree, or maybe they used to only need the bachelor's degree, more time and more debt.
I want to say hi to some more members who are joining us. We've got Don from Dallas, Edith from California, Jose from Florida, and Kevin. A ton of people are commenting in the stream right now. We've got Gregory who says, definitely believe my degree is valuable and has opened doors for me. That's great to hear, Gregory. Mason, however, says, best decision I ever made was not going to college. And we have a question here from Jenny. She asks, what about the problem that so many entering never get a degree? So they have debt and not the benefits.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that is an under-recognized problem. Only about 2/3 of people who enroll in a 4-year college or university actually graduate with a bachelor's degree within 6 years. Actually, even getting 2 extra years on the back end. And there are hundreds of colleges and universities in this country where the overall graduation rate is, less than half, less than 40%, less than 30% in some cases. The kind of numbers that we would never tolerate if they were in our high schools. Some of them are public institutions. A lot of them are for-profit institutions, which often don't have very good outcomes, particularly given how much money they charge. And so, yes, exactly right. The worst situation you can end up is to have the debt that you need for a college credential, but no college credential. Because the job market does not give you partial credit for going to college. You either have that credential or you don't.
And to that point, I wonder how this is exacerbating the economic divide that is already out there, and particularly even the racial divide when it comes to hiring in the professional workforce. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that students of color really have been disadvantaged in 2 directions. One, there continue to be real problems of structural racism in the American labor market. There's plenty of studies to prove this, that people from certain backgrounds are at a disadvantage when it comes to just basic hiring and screening and lots of things of that nature. At the same time, students, non-white students, particularly African-American students, borrow more money to go to college because they don't have as much money in their families. They didn't build up that housing equity because they couldn't buy a house. All the cumulative effects of discrimination over time means that even if you can get into college, even if you graduate with a good degree, that debt burden is much more. So those things together really do make it more difficult for some people.
And has New America done any studies, or do you have any evidence that people who graduate with a higher degree of debt are more likely to take jobs that maybe don't align with what they studied, just to have something to be able to start paying off those loans?
It's a little hard to tell, particularly with a bachelor's degree, because you don't necessarily major in the field that you are going to get a job in at the bachelor's level. So there are about 3 million people in the American labor market right now who have a bachelor's degree in psychology. It's a very popular major. There are only about 300,000 psychologists in the United States. So most people who major in psychology don't ever intend to become a psychologist. They get different kinds of white-collar jobs. They go into graduate school. They do this, they do that. And so, which isn't to, I don't want to make all of higher education sound like it's only about jobs, particularly at the undergraduate level. You're kind of learning how to be and how to live and how to think. And it's a whole kind of transformative and particularly for younger people, more traditional age students, a developmental experience that has value in and of itself. But if you borrowed money to get that degree, you can't pay it back with experience. You have to pay it back with dollars.
Mm-hmm. Some policymakers have suggested making undergraduate degrees or undergraduate university completely free or at a super duper low cost. Do you think that will help the student debt problem?
It certainly would, and that's not an unreasonable thing to aspire to, given that's in many ways the higher education system that we had in this country for a while, in the decades after World War II, when we built out our system of community colleges and public universities. You could go to college and pay out of pocket, or maybe work your way through college, a phrase that used to mean something and doesn't really anymore, and not take out large amounts of debt. We've gotten away from that. That's an American promise that is kind of unkept to this generation. Some states, not all, but some states have really pulled money out of their higher education systems, and the entire system just charges a lot more than it used to. Prices are way up. The inflation adjusted cost of going to a public college and university has tripled over the last several decades, and that in turn leads directly to the kind of debt numbers that we see.
So I know you're a huge proponent of the community college degree, and you mentioned how some in other countries they do a little bit more of that as far as training goes and trade work. But do you think that the community college degree holds the same esteem as a 4-year degree and is just as much of an entry to the workforce as a four-year degree?
No, I don't think so. It's a two-year degree. Many two-year degrees are specifically job-focused. Many two-year degrees, really the point of them is to do the first 2 years of a four-year undergraduate experience and transfer. So I wouldn't say it's the same, and particularly in management. It's most of our managers in across industries are people with bachelor's degrees, and again, that's only 1/3 of the workforce has a bachelor's degree. So if you want to be a manager, you need a bachelor's degree, and white collar managerial jobs are some of the most stable parts of an increasingly unstable labor market. So I think that, but at the same time, there are a lot of two-year programs in community colleges that provide really good entry into jobs without as much time, without as much debt, without as much cost. So the key is to create programs where people can keep their options open, right? Where you can earn credits towards a two-year degree. And then if you want to, at some point, go on to get that bachelor's degree, or maybe you don't. We don't always offer that flexibility. It's not always easy to transfer credits. That's something we can improve on.
I'm thinking of me at 17 or 18 going into college, and so many folks at that age, we don't really know what it is that we want to study, what we want to do. And it isn't until maybe we're 2 years into a four-year degree that we realize, actually, I completely dislike engineering, or I completely dislike, whatever it is. So the community college option really offers that possibility.
We need to think about, particularly given the amounts of money involved, college is about both opportunity and risk. So, if you are spending some time in school and you don't know exactly where you want to go, and again, that's part of the college experience, is to have a place to make those kind of decisions, to try new things, to expose yourself to different ideas and different paths, and be able to make changes in a way that's not like catastrophic for you financially. Well, the more college costs and the more debt you have to take on, the higher the risk. So in many ways, I think the move to make go back to affordable public higher education, to reduce the amount of debt, is also so people can do exactly the kind of things that you're describing and not run less of a risk of a really financially bad choice.
I want to talk about the master's degree now. As someone who went into debt getting her master's degree, you talk about questionable master's degrees. I would love for you to elaborate for our audience what you mean by that, and what those degrees are, in your opinion.
Master's degrees are job-focused degrees almost entirely, right? You don't get a master's degree to find yourself. You get a master's degree to enter a career. And what's interesting is, for a long time, you couldn't really tell how good your master's program was going to be from a job perspective. But over the last few years, the U.S. Department of Education has released information where you can now find out for any master's program at any college. You can just go right on the Department of Education website. It's called the College Scorecard, and see both the average and median amount of debt for people who enter that program, and how much money they make in the labor market 1 and 2 years after finishing their credential. It turns out there are wide variations, not just between schools, but between different kinds of programs. So, there are accounting programs that are affordable and lead to really good jobs, and there are accounting programs that cost a lot of money and in debt students and don't lead to really good jobs. That's true for almost any kind of field that you can name. And so consumers have more information at their disposal now to make smart financial choices for master's degrees than they did before. And we found there are a lot of master's programs that just do not pay off. They're not worth the money.
That's actually interesting for parents. Perhaps if you're a parent and you've got kids who are going into college, do you think that that's a good choice to make, or option, is to look at what the degree is, or what the starting salary is after you get the degree?
It's certainly something I would keep my mind on. Again, entering a bachelor's program may be more likely that you don't know when you start where you're going in, but maybe you do. Some people do. With a master's program, by definition, you know what you're going into, right? You're declaring your major by deciding what program to enter. You're in that major from the beginning. So I would say if you're going into a master's program, 100% look up the information, see how much debt people are taking on, see what the money looks like, just to make sure that things add up on the back end, right? Like you graduate, you're going to get that letter in the mail or that email saying, starting next month, you need to start writing us a check for this amount of money to pay your loan back. Is that, somewhere in the ballpark in terms of how much money you can expect to be making? Understanding there's a lot of variation and different people have different opportunities. I do think that that's relevant information, particularly if you're taking on debt. And that just makes such a big difference, right? If you get out without debt, you have choices. You can hang out and do this and do that and figure out your business. If that loan check is due right away, then your options are more limited.
I have a very interesting question from our member named Alan. He wrote, should schools have skin in the game instead of getting all the money up front, regardless of whether the student gets a degree? Do you have an answer to that, Kevin?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. And this is something that's being actively considered here in Washington, D.C. It's a pretty controversial idea. It's an idea that colleges, unsurprisingly, are very much opposed to, and they have like all interest groups, they have skilled lobbyists here in Washington who stalk the halls of Congress and try to prevent legislation that would be against their financial interests. But the bottom line is one of the big reasons that we've seen this explosion in student debt in the United States is that colleges get all the money and they bear none of the risk.
How much has COVID changed how we're viewing college and our four-year degree?
It's changed the two-year sector more than the four-year sector. The four-year sector has remained pretty stable. People who were kind of firmly on that track to get a bachelor's degree may have said, this really sucks that I have to take a year of college online. I don't like this. It's awful. But they kind of hung in there because, a lot of people who get bachelor's degrees, their parents were college graduates. There's no other kind of like path for them. So they're just going to kind of figure it out. What we have seen is a real decline in enrollment in community colleges, places that are more likely to enroll first-generation students, lower income students, students who are more academically marginal, students who are non-traditional, they're older, they have jobs, they have children, where college is more of a marginal decision. It's not the most important thing in your life. Enrollment has really dropped because of COVID in ways that I think are very problematic and very worrisome in thinking about the intersection between higher education and equality in this country.
Kevin, before I let you go, if I had a magic wand and I could let you make any one structural change to college as we know it here in the United States, what would that change be?
I think the change would be to really even out the public investment in different kinds of colleges and universities. We give a lot more money to the colleges that educate the privileged students than we do to the colleges that educate other students. For every dollar that goes to, and I'm not even talking about Harvard and Yale and all those places, which are rich as anything. They're so small, they don't even really matter in the broad conversation. But, we give way more money to the flagship public university that has the football team that everyone roots for than to the local community college, even though the local community college has a harder job, is more employment focused, is educating a lot more students who are, again, at the margins between whether or not they're going to have one path toward life or another one. We might give them 15, 20 cents on the dollar for what we give to the famous university. I would change that. I would treat everyone fairly and invest in all kinds of students in the same way. I think that would actually really pay off for us as a society because, frankly, some people are going to go to college regardless. That's just who they are, and they have the resources for it. It's the students that where maybe they will, maybe they won't. They're the highest return on public investment. We need to spend more on them.
Kevin, thank you so much for joining the show today. We've had tons of members participate, and it's been great. I want to end on a quote from Dan, our member, who said, high school students need to be educated on the reality of the cost of college, the degrees, their salary ranges, and employability. So sounds like Dan agrees with you here, Kevin. Thanks again for joining us here on LinkedIn Live. That was Kevin Carey. He is the Vice President of Education Policy and Knowledge Management at New America. And thank you again for everyone who participated here in the stream, in the comments. You can continue the conversation, or you can check out some of our other stories to the right of your feed, or if you're on mobile, click into the search box. Tomorrow, we release our next episode of our 6-part series, Reshuffle, hosted by Tamron Hall. This time, we take a look at one executive or music industry veteran who lost her job during COVID and decided to reinvent herself. Take a look.
We all know it. When it comes to industries across our country, the pay gap between women and men is staggering. Across their careers, working women face daunting challenges to career progression. One silver lining of the pandemic has been how the economic downturn has given working women a chance to reflect and reshuffle their entire careers. Whether it's changing professions or becoming your own boss, the future of corporate America is looking hopeful for women rejoining the workforce. I'm Tamron Hall, and this is Reshuffle.
And I'm Hina Melendez. Thanks for watching LinkedIn News Live.